It's great to be joined today by Brian Klaas, who's a fellow in global and comparative politics at the London School of Economics, also author of the book, The Despot's Accomplice, How the West is Aiding and Abetting the Decline of Democracy. It's so great to have you on. I think as a sort of general principle, we would consider that at the world level, we've seen more democracy since the Cold War. And you argue in the book that we've now seen a reversal in that. So I guess the first question is, how do we measure democracy in the world?
Sure, that's a good question. So you're absolutely right. We had a massive surge in democracy through the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. So Latin America democratized in the 80s, then we had Eastern Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa in the 90s after the Berlin Wall fell. And then it started to switch. And this tipping point happened in around 2006, according to the major indices. This doesn't happen always with, coups or civil wars or, massive authoritarian grabs of power. It's a slippage of what a lot of political scientists call democratic backsliding. But basically, there's a lot of indicators that look at the quality of democracy. And the harsh reality is that for 11 years, we've been going in the wrong direction. So authoritarianism is on the march and democracy is in retreat.
And what are some of the, I mean, generally, we've talked a lot about authoritarianism, certainly in the last year to year and a half. But what are some of the more specific indicators if we were to sort of create some kind of democracy score or
Sure.
mean or something like that? What sort of
Sure. So,
specifics can we look at?
so election quality is certainly one of them, how free and fair elections are. There's also press freedom. There's other aspects about how basically civil society is treated, how democratic the process of the rule of law is in making laws. There's a whole variety of them. There's a few different indices. Polity 4 does one, Freedom House does another. There's one called Varieties of Democracy that's a think tank in Sweden. So, there's a variety of different ways of measuring it, but the unifying thread of all of these different measurements is they're seeing the same trend. This doesn't mean the democratic sky is falling. So, more people live in democracy in human history now, basically, than any other time, except for the peak about a decade ago. So we're still doing relatively well by historic standards in the long trend, but we are looking at a consistent and very troubling decline. And I'm worried that right now, with policy changes that are happening, sweeping around the world, that decline is actually getting worse before it gets better.
Are there, or is there a place, I guess, is the question, when we think about democracy for factors such as income inequality, for example, or economic mobility, right? The idea of how easily can one move out of poverty if they are born into poverty, for example. Are those factors that have a role to play in thinking about democracy around the world?
Yeah, so if you think about the actual word democracy, it comes from two Greek words, demos and kratos. And I think what you're referring to is usually lumped into the kratos. So the demos is the people, the rule of the people. And the kratos is the power. And this is where, democracy itself is only good insofar as it actually generates results for people. So I say very clearly in the book, and I don't think this is a terribly controversial statement, but it's one you don't think about all that often, is you'd probably not rather be born in Benin in West Africa, even though it's a democratic state, compared to Singapore, which is an authoritarian state. Because you'd have to basically work for 65 years in Benin in order to receive the same salary you probably would get in Singapore. And at some point, the right to vote is not worth that much to a lot of people. So I think what a lot of people have lost track of is that democracy can be a moral and basic good no matter what, because it's important to have people have a say in their government, but it also has to deliver. And I think one thing that's hollowed out the quality of democracy in the West that has given rise to populism is a lot of people living in democratic states have seen their wages stagnate. They haven't been able to get ahead. And they're starting to turn to alternative models or alternative ways of thinking. And I think that's a mistake, even though I think it's also a wake up call that we need to reinvigorate the quality of our democracy.
Hmm. As far as populism is concerned, we've talked a lot on the program about how you can have sort of similar sounding populist rhetoric from potential or actual elected officials, but that in terms of governance, there's a pretty big difference between what we've sort of called progressive populism versus regressive populism. Can you talk a little bit about how the populist message more broadly cannot always directly relate to whether we're going to see an increase or decrease in democracy, or sort of how populist rhetoric can maybe muddy the waters in some sense?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the surge in populism around the world. If we look outside of the West, the sort of stereotypical cases of, the rise of populism in France right now or in the U.S. Around the world, you typically have illiberal populism. So this is where, you have echoes of this in the West, in the sense of Donald Trump's message of "I alone can fix it" is sort of an illiberal populist message. It's blending authoritarian rhetoric along with this idea that the little guy needs somebody else to look out for them. I mean, the irony of all this is that very often the standard bearers of populism are the ones who take advantage of inequality to ride to political office and then make political and economic inequality worse once they get there. And that's what's happening in the US right now. And I would argue will probably accelerate under, for example, Trump's tax plan. But the aspect that I think was the really big missed opportunity is that there is a genuine possibility for people in the left, the center left, et cetera, to say, we messed up. We have basically ignored the center of our country, the center of our economy for 30 years. We haven't done enough to blunt the sharp edges of globalization, but we're going to do this in a way that is about, bridges rather than walls. It's about trying to actually create strategies to fix the problems rather than just simply demonize people and blame them for them. So, I think that's the real missed opportunity that's happened in the West. And that's something that's very dangerous, because the more people believe that all politics is bad, and that's part of what the populist message is, the more that they turn to figures who are simply opportunists. And I think that's what we're seeing in a lot of places where, scapegoating is not actually a strategy. And when people begin to realize that robots and automation are a much bigger threat to them than China or Mexico or immigrants or whatever it is, they need somebody to pick up the pieces. And I'm hoping that, as the sort of tide switches back towards the adults, so to speak, the people who have skills and qualifications, there needs to be somebody ready to pick up that mantle who can speak the populist language, but also have a pragmatic strategy.
Brian, as far as religion is concerned, not in a sort of abstract way, but specifically as we've seen it applied around the world since the Cold War, can we make a general assessment about whether religion is currently a pro or anti-democratic influence in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it's very mixed, I would say. I think that religion has been exploited for authoritarian reasons sometimes, but very often in history, remember, some of the most tyrannical governments are completely secular and actually used the tools of the state to dismantle religion. I think it's somewhat neutral to a sense. It depends on how it's used and how it's sort of employed in pursuit of a specific ideology. But I would say that there is a trend. I mean, this has been identified for a long time. There's a famous article in Political Science called "McWorld versus Jihad," and this idea of, are we going to be this big global force which has maybe less room for religious local government, for example, or are we going to have sort of these village-based politics, tribal politics, and feeling like we can only look out for ourselves and not for the other? And religion certainly comes into that divide. So, I think that there's certainly a place for religion in the modern world, as long as it is not simply used to divide people. And what I think is really dangerous is when you have an illiberal populist message, an authoritarian, wrapped up in authoritarian rhetoric, that then uses religion as a tool or a weapon. So, I don't think it's anything that's innately good or bad. I think it just depends on how people exploit it or choose to work along the lines of those values that people hold.
In thinking about American foreign policy for a second, there are those in the United States who have more interventionist leanings. And part of that is based around this idea of spreading democracy. We heard that from the George W. Bush administration, for example. Is there any way we can assess whether Western efforts to, quote, spread democracy actually have a pro-democratic influence sort of in the net?
Sure. So one of the chapters in the book is, it very explicitly says, no more democracy wars, right? So first off, I think we need to make really clear that trying to spread democracy by the barrel of the gun does not work, and is very often counterproductive. And what's even worse that a lot of people don't think about is this tipping point of the retreat of democracy in 2006, I think is very largely linked to the Iraq War and the fact that authoritarian regimes around the world were able to credibly claim that any sort of US pressure in support of human rights or pro democracy NGOs on the ground or whatever was just a Trojan horse to prepare for regime change. And the Iraq War gave them that credibility because they could point to it and say, look, they did it elsewhere. So what ended up happening was all of a sudden these regimes around the world started purging NGOs, reformers, et cetera, and just saying this is the precursor to a CIA tactic or a US invasion. And of course, it wasn't the case, but they had the legitimacy to say that because of the Iraq War. The second aspect of this is I think that there's a very big problem with how our foreign policy signals things abroad. And this is what I'm most worried about now. I think the US can actually legitimately spread democracy effectively if it does it right. But what's happening now is sort of a perfect storm of every bad thing the US could do. And what I mean by that is that, over the weekend you had Trump inviting Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines to the White House.
Right.
He embraced President Sisi of Egypt. He congratulated President Erdogan of Turkey on rigging a referendum that dismantled democracy within a NATO ally. And people around the world, I mean, one thing we don't think about all that often, but I saw, in my travels from Madagascar to Belarus, et cetera, was every regime around the world looks to Washington for cues about what it can get away with. And when you have those signals coming out of the White House, it is extremely counterproductive. And it sends the signal that the US just doesn't even care anymore. One of the things that I found striking was I went back through Trump's old tweets, and I found that he has tweeted, as of yesterday, he tweeted for the 247th time about crowds, right? He's tweeted about human rights once. And the only time he tweeted about them was to mock Secretary of State John Kerry for caring about them. So when you have that message, every government around the world sees that and thinks, if we torture a few journalists, I don't really think that's going to be a big deal to Trump. And they're probably right. So, I think that it takes a very smart strategy, which is, I outlined 10 principles for how the US can be more effective in the book. But I think that we are going down a very dark path where the president is actually cheerleading these terrible governments as opposed to acting like a referee that can push them to follow the rules.
Well, the book is incredibly timely. Again, it's called The Despot's Accomplice: How the West is Aiding and Abetting the Decline of Democracy. We've been speaking with the book's author, Brian Klaas. Brian, thanks so much for talking to me today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show.